London has survived fires, plagues, bombings, but in 1814 something far stranger happened. A 15-foot wave of beer exploded through the streets of London, destroying homes and killing innocent people. Now, I don't class myself as a Brit, you can probably tell from the accent, but one thing that England and Scotland can always agree on is that we love to neck a pint, but I don't think we want to be neck deep in our pints. The flood didn't come from rain, it didn't come from the River Thames, it came from a brewery tank, and within minutes, thousands of gallons of dark porter turned one of London's poorest neighbourhoods into a disaster zone. This is the story of the London beer flood. In the early 1800s, London was exploding with growth. Factories were expanding, industry was booming, and one drink ruled the city: porter beer. It was dark, heavy, and cheap to produce. Porter became the working class drink of choice. One of the biggest producers was the Mukes and Company. Their massive facility, the Horse Shoe Brewery, stood near Tottenham Court Road. But right behind the brewery sat one of the poorest areas in London, the neighbourhood of St Giles. St Giles was infamous. Overcrowded houses, extreme poverty, families crammed into a single room. Some people even lived in the basement homes dug partially underground, and towering over them were gigantic wooden fermentation vats, some of the largest ever built. These vats were enormous. One stood 22 feet tall. That's roughly the height of a two-storey building. They were held together by huge iron bands, each weighing hundreds of pounds. Inside them, beer fermented for months. One vat inside the brewery could hold 3,555 barrels of porter, more than 580,000 litres of beer. For 10 months, the liquid inside had been fermenting, slowly building pressure, but the entire system depended on something surprisingly so fragile: those iron hoops holding the large vats together. On the afternoon of October 17th, 1814, a clerk named George Crick noticed something unusual. One of the iron hoops around the giant vat had slipped loose. Each hoop weighed around 700 pounds. Normally, that would be terrifying, but strangely, it wasn't considered unusual. Workers said the hoops sometimes slipped 2 or 3 times a year, so Crick reported it to his supervisor. The response was very simple: don't worry about it. They would fix it later. Crick wrote the problem down and went back to work. For nearly an hour, nothing happened. Then suddenly, the vat burst. Not cracked, not leaking, it exploded. The enormous pressure inside rippled the wooden container apart. Thousands of gallons of beer erupted into the brewery, but it got worse. The explosion knocked over another vat nearby, and then another. A chain reaction had begun. Within seconds, massive containers began emptying across the building. Between 128,000 and 323,000 gallons of porter surged through the brewery. The force smashed through the rear wall, and then the beer escaped into the streets. Witnesses described a 15-foot wave of beer bursting into the neighbourhood. Dark porter rushed through the narrow streets of St Giles. The liquid carried bricks, timber, and shattered barrels. 2 houses collapsed almost immediately. Basement homes filled with beer in seconds. People were knocked off their feet. Some were trapped beneath collapsing walls. Others drowned as the flood poured through their homes. The beer surged down George Street and then onto New Street. What started as a loose iron hoop had turned into a deadly wave. At least 8 people died in the flood. Most were among the poorest residents of St Giles. One of the strangest tragedies occurring during a wake. An Irish family was mourning a 2-year-old child who had died the day before. Friends and relatives had gathered inside the home. When the beer flood hit, the building collapsed. 5 mourners were killed. Another victim was Eleanor Cooper, a teenage barmaid working at the Tavistock Arms. When the brewery wall collapsed, she was buried under the rubble. For a disaster that sounds almost absurd, the deaths were brutally real. The flood ended quickly, but the destruction remained. Homes were destroyed, cellars were filled with beer. The area reportedly smelled like porter for months. Crowds gathered around the wreckage. Some stories claim people tried to collect the beer to drink, but historians say many of these tales were simply exaggerated. Most people were simply trying to survive the chaos. A coroner's inquest investigated the disaster, but the verdict surprised many people. The deaths were ruled casual, accidental, and by misfortune. In other words, an act of God. The brewery was not held legally responsible. Despite losing around £23,000 worth of beer, the company survived, and the brewery kept operating. The disaster did have one lasting impact. Brewers began abandoning giant wooden vats. They were gradually replaced by safer fermentation tanks. The Horse Shoe Brewery eventually closed. Today, the site is home to the Dominion Theatre. Thousands of people walk past it every day with no idea that beneath their feet once stood the brewery that caused one of the strangest disasters in British history. History normally remembers floods from rivers, from storms, from broken dams, but in 1814, London was flooded by something far stranger, a tank full of beer, and a disaster that proves sometimes the most unbelievable stories in history are also completely true.